Let me paint you a picture. Zimbabwe, a country is being born. After years of brutal colonial rule, after a liberation war that cost thousands of lives, a black African leader is finally standing at the top. His name is Robert Mugabe, and the entire continent is celebrating. Not just Zimbabwe, all of Africa. Because what just happened in that small Southern African country felt like proof that change was possible, that colonialism could be defeated, that people could fight for their land and actually win. Mugabe was not just the president. He was a symbol, a hero, the man who freed Zimbabwe. So how does that same man end up destroying the very country he fought to liberate? That is what we are breaking down today.
We started the war in order to get our country, and we haven't got our country. We have not asked for any inch of Europe or any square inch of that territory. So, Blair, keep your England and let me keep my Zimbabwe.
First, you need to understand who Robert Mugabe actually was. Because his story doesn't start in politics. It starts in a small village in colonial Rhodesia in 1924. Mugabe grew up watching his country operate under a system designed to keep black Zimbabweans poor, landless and powerless. White minority settlers controlled the best land. Black Zimbabweans were pushed into overcrowded areas with poor soil. The best schools, the best jobs, the best opportunities, all reserved for a small white minority. Mugabe watched all of it, and he studied obsessively. He earned multiple university degrees, some while he was in prison, because the colonial government locked him up for over a decade for speaking against white minority rule. 10 years in prison, and when he came out, he was more determined than ever. By the late 1970s, Zimbabwe was in the middle of a full liberation war. Mugabe had become one of the most important leaders of that struggle. Guerrilla fighters, international pressure, years of conflict. Eventually, the white minority government collapsed. And in 1980, Zimbabwe held its first free election. Mugabe won, overwhelmingly, landslide victory. And here's the part that surprises most people. In those early years, Mugabe was actually a decent leader. He preached reconciliation. He told white Zimbabweans they had nothing to fear. He invested in schools and hospitals. Zimbabwe's literacy rate became one of the highest in Africa. The economy was growing. The country was functioning. People who had fought against him during the Liberation War were sitting in his government. For a moment, it genuinely looked like Zimbabwe was going to make it. But power does something to people, especially power held for too long. And Mugabe held power for 37 good solid years. The cracks started showing in the 1980s. In the early years of his rule, Mugabe sent the military into Matabele land, a region in the south of the country, to crush political opposition. What followed was a massacre. Thousands of civilians were killed. It was called Gukurahundi, a Shona word meaning the early rain that washes away the chaff. The international community largely looked away because Mugabe was still the liberation hero, still the symbol. But inside Zimbabwe, people knew what had happened, and they never forgot. By the 1990s, Mugabe's grip on power was tightening. Opposition voices were being silenced. The press were being controlled, and a new pressure was building. War veterans from the liberation struggle were angry. They had fought for the land, and they still didn't have it. 2 decades after independence, the most fertile farms in Zimbabwe were still largely in white hands. That anger was real. That grievance was legitimate, but what Mugabe did with it was catastrophic. In 2000, instead of managing the land issue carefully, Mugabe unleashed it. War veterans and ruling party supporters began invading white-owned farms across the country. Farmers were beaten, families fled. Workers lost their homes overnight, and the government didn't just allow it, it encouraged it. Thousands of white commercial farmers were forced off the land in just a few years. Now, here's what you need to understand. The land inequality in Zimbabwe was real. The history behind it was painful. The demand for change was completely justified. But there's a difference between land reform and land destruction. These farms weren't just pieces of land, they were functioning businesses with machinery, irrigation systems, export contracts, trained workers, and decades of agricultural knowledge. When you remove all of that overnight and hand the land to people with no farming experience and no access to loans or equipment, the food doesn't just get produced. And that is exactly what happened. Crop production collapsed. Food shortages spread across the country. Factories that depended on farm output started shutting down. Foreign investors pulled their money out. The economy began to free fall. And then Mugabe made it worse. Instead of cutting government spending or finding a way to stabilize the economy, his government started printing money, more and more of it, to pay debts, to pay soldiers, to keep the system running. And inflation exploded. Prices changed daily, then hourly. People rushed to spend their salaries before the money became worthless. By 2008, Zimbabwe's inflation rate had become one of the worst in human history. The government printed a $100 trillion banknote. 100 trillion. And it could barely buy a loaf of bread. Hospitals ran out of medicine. Schools fell apart. Millions of Zimbabweans left the country just to survive. An entire generation grew up inside one of the worst economic disasters the world had ever seen. And through all of it, Mugabe blamed the West, blamed sanctions, blamed foreign interference. He never once stood before his people and said, "I made mistakes." Because by that point, Robert Mugabe had been in power for so long that he had confused himself with Zimbabwe itself. He genuinely believed that what was good for him was good for the country. That is what unchecked power does to a person. It doesn't just corrupt them, it blinds them. In 2017, after 37 years in power, the military finally stepped in. Mugabe was placed under house arrest, and a few days later, the man who had ruled Zimbabwe for nearly 4 decades resigned. He died 2 years later in 2019 in a hospital in Singapore, away from the country he had once given everything to liberate. So here's what I want you to take away from this story. Mugabe was not always a villain. That is the complicated truth. He was a man who suffered under colonialism, who fought back when fighting back was dangerous, who genuinely helped his country in the early years, but he stayed too long, held on too tight, and slowly, the man who freed Zimbabwe became the man who couldn't let it go. The liberator became the captor. The hero became the cautionary tale, and Zimbabwe, a country with some of the most fertile land in Africa, a country that once fed an entire region, is still trying to recover from the decisions of one man who forgot that the country was never his to destroy. If this story made sense to you, there are more like it on this channel. Real history, broken down simply. Subscribe and don't miss the next one.